Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the home theater geek. Welcome to AVS Forum Tech Talk. I'm joined, as always, by my technical director, Chris Mata, and he's usually lurking behind the scenes there somewhere. Hey, Chris,
Hey.
how you doing, man?
Could be better. Definitely be
Well,
better.
yep. I want to make sure everybody knows that Chris is also known as That Home Theater Dude with a very popular YouTube channel, so be sure to go check that out.
Thanks.
On t- yeah, thank you for being here and for taking care of all the stuff behind the scenes. This week's guest is Rob Brennan. He's the product technology manager for home entertainment at Sony Electronics. Hey, Rob, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here. Looking forward to having a robust and enjoying conversation with you today.
Indeed, thank you. Yeah, I am too. Sony, is at the forefront of a lot of consumer electronics, so there's a lot to talk about. I want to start with displays. And Sony is one of two companies, for example, that was first out of the gate with QD OLED. Probably the first relatively new flat panel display technology in quite some time. Why did Sony jump on that bandwagon so early?
It's a great question. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to take your statement a little further. This is demonstrably a departure in terms of display technologies.
Mm-hmm.
When you really think about what QD OLED is really talking about, it's really talking about color fidelity and color accuracy and, of course, color volume. And when you think about just the color component of consumer display technology, both LCD and OLED essentially produce color the same way. It doesn't really matter that one is self-emissive and one is using backlight, whether it's zone-based or direct. It doesn't really matter. They essentially operate from a color perspective with the same concept, and they therefore have about the same level of performance when it comes to color. Now, of course, color and contrast are associated, so OLED is wildly different in terms of contrast than LCD. But in terms of color reproduction, they're nearly identical. So QD OLED is a major departure in terms of color reproduction. It's been a very long time since have had a change this significant. As far as why Sony wanted to jump on, kind of, we'll call it a bandwagon, sure, why not? I wanted to, jump on, right away. For the longest time, Sony's kind of guiding principle in consumer display technologies has been what we call creative intent, right? How can we faithfully recreate whatever the vision of your favorite movie director or favorite TV show or video game or whatever, in the home. So we're always looking for new tools to enable us to do that. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we spend a lot of time and money and effort and research and development with processing, but it's always helpful to have good foundational tech, to begin with. Mm-hmm. And that really is why we wanted to jump on first. If you wanted to allow me, I'll go a little bit further into talking about the color.
Yeah,
I
please.
actually had a slide, Chris. If you want to pull up that first slide, and I'll illustrate what I was talking about with the similarities between OLED and LCD when it comes to color. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of information here, and I'm trying not to treat this like it's a presentation, but essentially, on the left-hand side, you basically see how color is created by modern LCD televisions. Short version, without going too far into the weeds, is blue LEDs. That blue light is converted to white light via a couple of different technologies, whether it's a quantum dot layer, whether it's Sony's triluminous, whether it's nanocrystal, doesn't really matter. It's converted to white light, and then that white light is passed through color filters. So we have filtered white light. There you go. Which
is very inefficient, if I'm not mistaken. There's a lot of light energy that gets lost in that process.
Right. There certainly is. And there's also issues with the purity of those colors in terms of consistency, not just panel to panel, but also, pixel to pixel. But I actually have a slide for that, as well. But going back to this first slide, if you look now in the center, you can see with the traditional, OLED or WOLED or whatever you want to call, non-QD OLED these days, essentially you have red, green, and blue, and they combine together to make white light. So those red, green, and blue, light emitting components are not directly related to each of the subpixels. They work together to create white light, again, filtered. Where QD-OLED is different is that it starts with 100% blue light source. And then we use quantum dots to essentially color shift that light from blue to green or blue to red at the subpixel level. So this is the first time that you are seeing in a consumer, well, not the first time actually. You go back long enough, there was, the Qualia series from Sony's way back in the day. But essentially in modern times, this is the first consumer display where you're seeing true red, green, and blue. And so, Chris, if you go show the next slide real fast, I talked about kind of color accuracy and color consistency. Quantum dot is very good at producing very narrow color bands, which means they're very precise blue, very precise red, very precise green. Whereas color filters are a little more, let's say, generous with the colors that they will allow through.
Quite a bit more generous, yes.
Quite a bit. And so when you think about, how we're going to make all of the billions upon billions of colors and nuance in any kind of picture, the more accurate you start with your primary colors, the more ultimately accurate you can be with the final result. So not only is it just better for accuracy in general, but wider color gamut. And there's some other benefits to QD-OLED as well, but it really is a major departure from how color's been produced for a number of years.
Right, exactly. Actually, we already have a question in the chat room. This is a bit more practical question, but since it's there, I'll ask it. Will Sony displays offer HDMI 2.1 on all ports in the near future?
That's a great question. No one's ever asked me anything about HDMI 2.1 before, if you'll believe that.
No, I can't believe that. I'm sorry. I don't believe that.
Which you should not believe.
Right.
It's a good question. I can't today comment on what we're going to be doing in the future. We have kind of a release schedule, and we'll make announcements when we're ready to make those announcements.
I'm sure.
A roadmap, if you will. What I will tell you is we certainly have taken this feedback from our consumers very seriously, passed it into our engineering team, passed it into our product planning team, and we're having conversations around, enhanced connectivity, enhanced capabilities all of the time. So Sony's not just looking to, make a television that kind of sets the bar for picture quality, but also usability. So I will say, continue to stand by. Just know that we take, your feedback and your, wants and desires very seriously, and we talk about them in great depth internally to try to make the best product for our customers that we can.
Yeah, that's good. Good to know. And I'm sure we'll learn more at CES in just over 1 month's time.
It's coming quick.
Coming quick, right down the street. Another technology that Sony has really led the way on, I think, is what I'm now calling, a lot of people are now calling direct view LED or DV LED, which up till recently has been more likely called micro LED, but it's not necessarily micro because there are some specific definitions. Regardless of that, what's going on with Sony's version of that called crystal LED?
Well, super excited to talk about crystal LED technology. Before I talk about that real quick, what I do want to say is one of the things that kind of sets Sony apart from some of the other TV manufacturers, we're not completely unique in this regard. But aside from crystal LED, Sony's not really in the panel manufacturing game, right? And so that allows us a certain amount of flexibility to take advantage of.
You guys don't have an LG, like an LG display or a Samsung display, which make raw panels that they then sell to other people, including Sony.
Right. And ultimately that kind of freedom allows us to pick and choose the technologies that we want to use in various kind of applications. In the case of, crystal LED, this is something that we're building in-house. So crystal LED is still, I would say, primarily focused on more commercial applications, although it is available for consumer applications as well. What makes crystal LED very different from other display technologies, besides kind of the hard differences, is that you have a fixed pixel pitch. And so, Chris, if you want to, that third slide actually will have this. And so because it has a fixed pixel pitch at the manufacturing level of 1.26 millimeters, What that means is if you want to change the resolution, you change the size of the video wall, essentially, the number of tiles that you're going to use. So people ask, can I get a crystal LED wall in 4K? Yes, you can. It's 220 inches diagonal because of that. So because of some of those kind of engineering requirements, it does tend to lend itself more toward kind of commercial applications, whether that's for retailers have used this, some automotive manufacturers have put in crystal LED walls so they could do full scale kind of one-to-one, modeling of vehicles for colors and for overall design, those kind of things. But it certainly can be installed in different aspects, different sizes, different shapes, in lots of kind of unique spaces, including, home use. The other thing that makes it very unique is that, again, you're right, the micro LED terminology is a little bit softly defined. But again, Chris, if you pull that slide up, that image one more time, what really makes the crystal LED wall so fantastic to look at, if you ever have a chance to see one in person, it's really stunning. 99% of the overall screen is black. There's the actual micro LEDs only take up 1% of the overall screen. And so despite the fact that this is certainly, an LED/LCD kind of based product, it gives you the black level performance of OLED without any type of blooming, because the pixels are so far separated from each other that light leakage doesn't happen. So you have this massive, ultra high, kind of resolution, 1000 nit, pure black display. That's just stunning to kind of look at.
Well, believe me,
fortunately, my theater room isn't big enough for one, so
right.
There are some limitations.
I do agree with you. I've seen it. I've been to Sony Pictures where they have a room, or they did at one time anyway, with a crystal LED display, and we watched a movie on it. And you're right, it's stunning. Another application that I've seen that I really think is great, and I don't know if Sony's into this, probably is, what's called virtual production, wherein they're shooting a scene and the actor is on a stage, a sound stage, but instead of a green screen around them, as is the case with many like superhero movies and stuff like that, you actually have a display such as crystal LED behind, showing the background that is in the shot, and the camera is capturing that along with the action with the actors. And I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, it's one of the major applications actually for the crystal LED solution. And that's not just with Sony Pictures, but also, other studios, including Lucasfilm, Industrial Light and Magic. They've used
Marvel.
The Marvel. They've used, the crystal LED wall, as well. The real benefit, it's really twofold. One is a benefit to the actors themselves, because they now have a better way to understand what it is that they are kind of being surrounded by,
right?
Rather than just people running around in blue or green suits,
right?
But they can see the environment, and that can help inform their performance.
Yeah.
But the other kind of technical advantage from a filmmaking perspective is now you can, let's say you want your actor to be looking over the edge of a cliff at sunset. Mm-hmm. You put the sunset on the screen, and you are using that light to illuminate now your actor. Right. So you can have very consistent light effects from kind of your three-dimensional model and your live kind of elements. And that's really what separates good computer-generated kind of graphics, good CGI from bad CGI, is the consistency of lighting. If you're ever looking at something and the CG is particularly bad, I can almost guarantee you it's because of inconsistent lighting, and your brain is telling you something is wrong with this image. So we do a lot of work in that space, again, both inside Sony and outside of Sony, with crystal LED.
Is there, what about the application of that technology in the commercial cinema? I know that there have been a couple of examples. Samsung obviously has a similar technology, and there was one example of it in Southern California, but I don't know if Sony's gotten into that or not.
Yeah, no, it's another unique kind of application. One of the challenges when it comes to kind of theatrical spaces is essentially how you're going to handle the acoustics. When you think of a traditional movie theater you go to, you have a perforated screen, you have speakers behind that screen.
Yep.
The screen itself is not super acoustically reflective. Whereas essentially if you build call it 440-inch diagonal glass wall, you're going to have to account for acoustics. Not only how do you get the center channel to work the same way that we would in a traditional media or traditional theater where it's behind the screen, but how do you control all of the reflections that are going to be bouncing around the room? You have a very large screen that's going to want to vibrate, with resonance and kind of potentially muck up the works.
Sure.
So it is something that we are looking at. I spent some time working on some of the technologies and new ideas with our engineering team. Nothing that's ready to really talk about from publicly, but I can tell you it is a problem that we are trying to tackle head on and marry ultimately video and audio. Right now, that really is the next kind of big test that needs to be passed.
Right. So there are no crystal LED screens in commercial theaters at this time.
Correct. No, not at this time. They are, primarily used, like I said, in more commercial applications,
Commercial and
like
industrial,
like commercial, exactly, and industrial from either manufacturing or retail. There are some major retailers who we've put the walls in their retail spaces. They don't want me to say who, but you've probably seen them if you go out and buy stuff. But that's typically the use case at this point. And then the other one would be kind of the Uber theater kind of nerd. I remember seeing a video on YouTube. It was about a house in Hollywood or California called The One. At one point, it was like the most expensive mansion in the U.S. And I know that the developer, famously filed for bankruptcy, and that place sold for pennies on the dollar. But it did have 3 crystal LED video walls in the house. So if you're looking, to go get one of those, maybe just buy the mansion.
Yeah, buy the mansion instead.
Screens come with it.
Well, and that's another. It's talking about 110-inch or 220-inch display. You remember the days in CES when we would have Panasonic would have 100-inch plasma, and Sharp had 108-inch LCD, and everybody said, "Well, how do you get it into the house?" And mostly the answer was, well, you build it into the house while the house is being built. You crane it in through the roof before the roof goes on, that kind of thing. With crystal LED or this DV LED technology, you don't have to do that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. One of the major limitations when it comes to, LCD or even OLED, televisions, besides as they get larger, then the cost goes up. But of course, there are market forces that are constantly bringing those prices. It wasn't that long ago that, a 98-inch, 4K television was $60,000. And of course, that's not the case anymore.
No.
So that kind of pressure in the market continues to kind of happen. The biggest problem with large flat panel screens is logistics. It's the manufacturing, it's the shipping, it's getting it delivered, it's getting it installed, ripping out holes in your roof to drop it in. And so that's where these kind of video wall, these modular based systems, make sense. It's also where something like, for example, Sony projection makes sense. So when I think about Sony's projection offerings compared to television, I don't look at them as wildly, kind of different strokes for different folks here. There comes a tipping point where, based on size, projector is just either a better solution or possibly the only solution to really get you what you're looking for. And if you are in the, of course, 85-inch and below, go with a television. So I look at them as kind of a 1-2 punch, which is, why we're really excited about some of the new advances we've made in the projection business, as well as kind of the flat panel display business.
Right. But of course, one of the main differences between flat panels and projectors is brightness. I mean, projectors don't get nearly as bright as flat panels, and so that brings up for me always the question of HDR, high dynamic range. which depends on greater brightness as well as deeper black. But deeper black, okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, higher brightness can obviously be obtained on flat panels, but not necessarily on projectors.
It is certainly a challenge that the industry is trying to take on. There have been major improvements in brightness overall, but when you really think about, it's kind of, we'll segue a little sideways, then we'll come back. When you really think about how pretty much all projectors essentially operate, is that they are very similar to direct kind of lit LED televisions, right? You have a light source and you have little shutters that have to try to block the light to give you preserved black level. And then when you want them to be bright, they open up. So you can continue to add horsepower and lumens, to your light engine, but you start to overpower your ability to shut it out when you want to maintain black level. And so that's the balance. We can get bright, but that doesn't mean you're going to have, good contrast. Now, coming back to your question, the good news is this. It's pretty easy to trick our brains and eyes into seeing something or feeling that we're seeing something. When you think about kind of brightness, there's kind of two ways that we can think about it. One is just the linear scale of things getting brighter. If I have a 55-inch screen and I have 100 nits versus 1,000 nits, 1,000 nits is brighter. But if I have a 1,000 nit 55-inch television and I have a 300-inch display that's maybe only half as bright, I will perceive the larger screen as brighter due to size. So there is a trade-off that kind of happens. But HDR is certainly kind of tricky in the world of projection. The other thing I'll point out is that HDR primarily is a TV technology. It's designed for televisions. The EOTF tracking is designed to kind of mimic the performance of televisions. Your favorite movies are mastered on televisions. When you go buy a Blu-ray, even though you're going to watch it on your projector, there's no projector version of the movie you're going to buy.
Good point.
The version you are buying was made by the studio when they were
on
looking
a
at
TV.
a TV.
Yeah.
And so that's the look that they're kind of going for. So projectors make a great overall experience, but it is a different kind of experience. It's more immersive, just generally due to the size. When you start to see things, kind of one-to-one scale, it goes a long way to convincing us something is real. So the emotional reaction you get can be, more intense due to size than it is due to dynamic range, which is what you get maybe with a OLED or LCD-based television.
Kent Daigle in the chat room is saying, but there's nothing better than sports or movies with controlled lighting on a large projector screen, and which goes to your point of larger equals more immersive, basically. Right.
It's interesting because this example I would give maybe 3 years ago maybe isn't as powerful as it is today because our viewing habits, post kind of pandemic have changed. But just a couple of years ago, we could watch HDR at home or you could go to the movie theaters. But we still went to the theaters and no one ever walked out and said, that was a great movie, or it would have been if the HDR was any good. It just doesn't happen, right? We go there.
I have heard some geeks complain, for example, about Dolby Vision in a Dolby Cinema, saying you don't call that HDR, you call that EDR, extended dynamic range, or enhanced, but it's not real HDR. And, okay, that's probably true because the peak brightness coming off a Dolby Cinema screen is just over 100 nits. 100 nits, but that's twice as bright as the standard up to that point for movie theaters, which is 48.
Right. And that difference at that size makes a
big difference.
Impact.
Oh, huge. Not to mention the black level.
Right. No, there's certainly, let's call them more passionate video enthusiasts.
let's
call them. And that's fine, right? I'm certainly not going to change anyone's mind on something that they say that they like and their eyes tell them this is better than that. That's your business, God bless you.
Sure.
But ultimately we did not kind of reject movie theaters because they weren't bright enough. We didn't
Right.
project them because the black level wasn't anywhere close
Right.
to what you can get at home.
Right.
It's the size and the spectacle. And again, the comment you put there from Kent is spot on. There are few things as kind of immersive and impactful as watching something on a big screen. So we got World Cup action that kind of just kicked off a couple of days ago.
Uh-huh.
If you have a chance to watch, your favorite team, or maybe it's the team you hate the most and you want to lose, I don't know.
Yeah, right.
But you can watch them on your smartphone and you can see all the action and you
Right.
can get the score.
Right.
Or you could watch it on, let's say, 120, 150 inch screen. I promise you the experience is not the same.
Right. Right. I totally agree with that. I totally agree. So speaking of projectors, Sony has famously gone for, there are three technologies that one can use in projectors, at least basically. There's LCD, there's DLP, and there's what's more generically called LCOS, liquid crystal on silicon, which is the technology that Sony chose and developed it into a variant that you call SXRD. Remind me what that stands for now. I can't recall.
It's a tough one. Silicon crystal reflective display.
That's right. And the X is for crystal.
Yes, it's Xtal.
Yeah,
so
right.
Obviously crystal.
Yeah, obviously. So why did Sony end up choosing that particular technology out of the three that were available?
Great. It's a fantastic question. So you got to remember back kind of at the time in movie theaters, which is really primarily what we were engineering for, you had 3-chip DLP.
Right.
So 3-chip DLP is a phenomenal technology. Excellent contrast, excellent motion, temporal resolution, excellent resolution, excellent color. It's just wildly expensive at kind of the top end in terms of what movie theaters were kind of developing.
Sure.
On the other kind of side, you had 3LCD, right? And 3LCD is certainly inexpensive, but really was used for, it's the kind of the classroom projector. It's the business projector.
Or the business projector, right.
Exactly, right. The contrast isn't great. The brightness can be very good. The resolution is kind of okay. The colors are kind of, not so wonderful. So LCOS, liquid crystal on silicon, and Sony's version SXRD is a way that we can get a lot of the advantages of 3-chip DLP, or closer to the performance of 3-chip DLP at a fraction of the cost. And that is the short version as to why we went with that technology. Now, the reason that it's superior to 3LCD from a contrast and color perspective is with 3LCD, that's a transmissive medium, right? The light passes through kind of your LCD, picks up the color, and then the light is gone, right?
Right.
Whereas with LCOS or SXRD, it's a reflective-based surface, which basically gives me two chances, right? I pick up the color through the polarizing filter, and I have two chances to block those pesky photons I don't want. So I get much better contrast performance that is much closer to a 3-chip DLP solution. So we initially made SXRD that went to movie theaters. A lot of movie theaters around the U.S. Were adopting Sony SXRD projectors, and then we started to bring that to consumers, first in full high definition, and now ultimately in 4K is where we are today. And recently we made a kind of a major shift kind of in our projection business. Our new lineup, the new XW series, is now all laser. So we've completely done away, at least on the, again, this is the kind of the consumer home theater projection front, completely done away with lamp-based projectors, which are awesome for a long time, but now all laser. So significantly longer lamp life, more stable color reproduction, stable contrast performance, and you can, treat it kind of like a television. When I had a lamp-based projector in my theater room, if my kids wanted to have a sleepover and their friends were going to want something, if they came down to get a snack, I would ask them if they turned the projector off. I don't want you to waste the next 50 minutes of my lamp life by getting popcorn. It's like, go turn it off and come back.
Right.
And, with the laser 20,000 hours, it's like, no, run it all day.
Who cares? Yeah. Well, what about, speaking of lasers, then, there are two approaches to that. You could actually have a red, a green, and a blue laser, which would be ideal, I think. But then many people implemented a lower cost version, which is a blue laser with a means of converting it to white, which is typically throwing the blue light through a yellow phosphor. And as those of us who are real geeks know, blue plus yellow in the right proportions and at the right wavelengths equals white.
Right. And that's primarily where the industry kind of is today. I actually had a slide for this. I can't remember the number. I think it's the fourth slide.
Four.
Chris. Yeah. So I will point out, Sony does make a one triple laser design in the consumer space. The GTZ 380 uses a red and then a dual blue laser setup. One of those blues passes through the phosphor wheel. So we have blue, and then deep red. First of all, the reason why using red is challenging is if you remember kind of the spectrum of light that humans can see, just beyond red is this other wavelength you can't see, but you can feel. It's infrared.
Called another AKA heat.
It's called things are getting warm, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges with using a kind of a triple laser design like the GTC 380 is the additional kind of heat generation. And so one of the things we had to develop for the GTC 380 specifically to make this work is a completely new cooling system. It's liquid cooled, a completely new fan-based system. We actually attached basically a think of it like a flywheel or a fan to the back of the phosphor wheel, which is always spinning. So right next to the light source, we're pumping through a ton of air, and we're using radiators and liquid cooling to keep the temperature down. Now, in all other Sony laser projectors, we'll call it Z phosphor laser. That's kind of the marketing technology you'll see. Yeah. That's referring to a dual blue laser system. Deep blue, as well as the kind of blue through the phosphor wheel to give us kind of white. The reason we add the deep blue is so that from a wide color gamut perspective, we can preserve some of the more intense blue colors that are difficult to produce with just white light that's run through a phosphor wheel. And that's essentially what's kind of happening with Sony SXRD, or imagers and our projectors. The other change that we've made, and this is with the XW series, is we've redesigned the SXRD panels themselves. They used to be what we would call kind of DCI 4K, 4096 by 2160. So that's not consumer 4K. It's
right, and we should make sure that everybody, we should make sure everybody understands that consumer 4K is 3840 by 2160 pixels.
Right.
Whereas DCI or digital cinema 4K is 4096 by 2160. So it's a little bit wider. And Sony, in fact, has been one of the only companies to actually offer native DCI 4096 by 2160 panels. You're not doing that anymore? Right.
We were doing that up until this most recent cycle, because that was essentially the resolution used in the professional theaters.
Right.
And remember, SXRD was designed for that use case, and then we just made a small version for home. Right. No, we made the change because the reality is that resolution doesn't mean anything in home use. There's no content that takes advantage of it. It ultimately is 7% wider than the 16 by 9 4K that we're used to. And so think of it like this. If I have 1,000 lumens and that light equally illuminates the entire SXRD panel, then 7% of that light is never used because I'll never use the full resolution.
Good.
So it's not particularly efficient, right?
Yeah.
So we re-engineered it. So now it's 3840 2160. It means it's a little smaller. So the chassis are smaller. We also re-engineered the panels so they're 10% more reflective, and they are 50% more efficient at kind of preserving black level. Oh. So we've gone to laser. They're brighter. They're more efficient at passing light and maintaining black level. All around, it's a phenomenal new lineup that we're super excited to be able to bring out. So not just laser, but every component, every major component in the projector, including the lens, all had to be redesigned because we designed a new SXRD panel.
A new SXRD chip. Okay. All right. Were those introduced at CEDIA?
Those actually were introduced, I want to say around April of last year.
Okay. All right. Before CEDIA.
Yeah, we certainly had them. See, a lot of dealers, especially the smaller dealers, hadn't had a chance really to get a lot of hands-on or eyes-on at CEDIA. So we made a big show of them at CEDIA, but they were announced more in the April timeframe last year. Yeah.
One last question about lasers then. Even in your high-end triple laser consumer projector, you have a red, a blue, and another blue. Why not just go red, green, blue?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the challenges when it comes to green is when we think about kind of red, green, blue to make white, right? The natural kind of conclusion is, well, you just add equal parts red, green, blue, and you get white, correct? And that would be true if you were mixing colors, more or less. But in the world of video, it is wildly not true. It's like white is like 70% green. It's mostly green,
right?
And part of the reason for that is we humans, we're very sensitive to the color green. So green has to be very precisely controlled. And it may seem counterintuitive, but that's part of the reason why we don't want to go with a green-based, laser system. First, most of the display technologies, at least in the modern era, are all based on blue light. That's the technology that's understood kind of the most. It's the most kind of energy. It's the most high intensity energy in terms of the wavelength, so you can do the most with it. And we're also so sensitive to green that any miscalculation with green, any inconsistency with green, we just pick up on immediately.
Instantly, yeah.
Because we're just engineered to know the difference. And that goes back to, people hiding out in caves because the predators are in the jungle.
Right.
So we became very sensitive at knowing the difference between, grass and predators hiding in the grass.
Right.
That's kind of where that comes from.
Right. Okay. So I know one of the topics that you wanted to talk about, and I do too, is the importance of processing in all video. Because you've got SXRD projectors, other people have LCOS projectors. You've got OLEDs, other people have OLEDs. You have LCDs, other people have LCDs. The technology for getting the picture to your eye is very common. But what sets one set apart from another, and I have to agree with what you have told me offline, is the processing, the video processing.
Yeah, it really is the single most important component in determining the final performance of what you're going to get. When you think about a television, not only is it a television a commodity product, but all of the parts of a television are commodity product, right? If you were to take Sony television and cut it in half, and you take one of our competitors and you cut their TV in half, you're going to find a lot of similarities. You're going to find, HDMI boards. They're maybe even made by the same company. You're going to find, potentially the same panels. You're going to find the same tuners. You're going to find all of these kind of, if not identical, extremely similar components.
Sure. I mean, all the OLED TVs in the world almost are made by LG Display and sold to LG Electronics and Sony and Samsung. Well, Samsung doesn't make OLEDs. Well,
now Quantum Dot OLED is
they do, but they make that panel. So that
correct.
But my point is, the raw panel itself, and as you point out, also a lot of the electronics, the HDMI chip and so on, are all made by third parties, OEMs we call them, and original equipment manufacturers, and then companies like Sony buy them and put them in their TV.
And when it comes down to it, we intrinsically know this is the case. But I will freely admit that in my experience, people in kind of the TV business forget this lesson. You can take, the high performance. I'll give you a cheap analogy, right? You can take a high performance sports car with all the bells and whistles, all the driver assists, and everything else, and give it to an unskilled teenager, and they're going to wrap themselves around a tree. That's just what happens.
Yeah.
It's not about the componentry; it's about the control. What's the difference between the world's best bowler and the world's second best bowler? They're bowling with the same ball, right? They're using all the same equipment. The difference is in the manipulation of that equipment. And so when you think about what has to happen from kind of a video perspective. Let's just talk video here for a second.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of things. So people ask me all the time, hey, can I completely defeat processing in my TV? And the answer is no, you cannot completely defeat it, because at the very base level, it has to at least account for variance within each panel's performance, right? So the first thing a processor has to do is to bring your overall TV performance to zero, right? It's got to at least level it, so from there it can have consistent kind of performance. So that's the first thing processing has to do. We evaluate each panel that goes into a TV, whether it's LCD or whether it's OLED. We see how it's performing, and then we adjust it to kind of a known baseline. That's the first thing that a processor has to do. The next thing a processor has to do is look at the incoming video signal. Now that we've changed, and we're still in the process of changing how we get the content that we watch, the quality of those signals is all over the place, right? You've got high compression, low bandwidth, lower resolution content coming through all of the time that has to be kind of combed through. What are we trying to do with this image? What's the intention here, so that we can create something that is reasonable to look at on the screen? Even when you think about upscaling, we often forget this, right? But if you're watching high definition on your 4K television, that means 75% of the pixels on screen are made up.
Right.
The processor just was like, hey, 75%, yeah, I'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. That's a heck of an ask.
Yeah, it is.
For any processor, ultimately to do. And the last thing I'll say about this is really the proof is in the pudding. The reason why we love things like TV shootouts, the reason why, reviewers look at all the various televisions is because there are differences in terms of their final performance. And it really comes down to video processing, analyzing the incoming signal, and then making decisions as to how to get the best performance, out of that signal, given your particular hardware.
And I think in the last few years, a lot of companies have started to tout the use of AI, artificial intelligence, in their processors. Do you think that has resulted in a big leap forward in processor performance?
It certainly has helped, although I jokingly would say the only thing better than artificial intelligence is actual intelligence. But that's a good-natured jab. That's not me being. Certainly machine learning helps quite a bit. So we have laboratories where we have picture quality engineers sit down and they will feed video signal through essentially our processor, through the algorithm, and then they will look at the end result. And essentially, machine learning, and I apologize if there are any experts kind of listening to this, because I'm going to give you the most rudimentary explanation. If the image result that comes to the process in the algorithm is good, the machine learning algorithm gets rewarded, and if it's wrong, it gets punished. And so that's how the machine learns what to do. Right. And so that's essentially what how machine learning AI works kind of in this. At a
very basic level.
At a very basic level. Right. So it certainly has helped. Right. And there's been a lot of work done by a lot of companies when it comes to AI-based upscaling. On the gaming side, there's a lot of work that's happening now in AI kind of temporal frame generation and kind of on-demand kind of image resolution modulation, so that you can get higher frame rates, especially for these much higher resolutions. So a lot of that has helped the industry in general, but there is also art as well as science. At the end of the day, you need to have someone sit down with trained eyes and look at it and say, did my algorithm get it right? Or did it not get it right? And do I need to tweak it? And that's kind of the thing that sets Sony uniquely apart, in that in-house, we can sit down with creators. We can sit down with our partners at Sony Pictures or Sony Television or Sony Animation, and we can say, give us your film. We'll run it through, our processor. We'll look at the end result together, and you tell us, does this meet your artistic vision? If not, what's wrong with it? And then we'll adjust from there.
Well, you bring up a really good point, and something I've always been impressed with Sony about. Your company's sort of phrase or motto or tagline, if you will, really means something. From lens to living room, right? So Sony as a company, as an overarching company, has major involvement in every aspect of content creation, from shooting. Sony cameras are used on many movies and TV shows and everything, all the way to the display at the end in the consumer's living room of a flat panel TV or a projector, which I think gives Sony something of a unique perspective on everything involved in making content.
Well, I agree with you there. It certainly does provide us with a unique perspective. It also enables us. We have a kind of a unique advantage in that it's easier for us to bring the kind of these different kind of business entities together to work on something. I'm not going to suggest that other TV manufacturers or projector manufacturers don't care about image quality.
Well, of course they do.
It's not like image quality is a uniquely Sony trait.
No. Not
but
at
I
all.
think it, to a degree, and maybe this is going to come off a little odd to say it this way, but I think it's more important to Sony because we have other sister companies who will be really mad when we get it wrong. It's like, the Cine Alta camera, James Cameron, famously when he was shooting, Avatar, and now of course the new Avatar is coming out, basically came to Sony and said, yeah, your camera's great, but will you cut it in half for me? And we're like, yeah, sure, no problem. We can redesign it so he could make the movie he wanted to make. And so ultimately, then we better be able to come back to him with our professional monitors. We better be able to come back to him with our consumer projectors and our televisions, and it better be right.
Yeah.
Because we were involved with him through all of these various, kind of touch points. And so that's what I mean when I say I think it's more important to us in that if we get it wrong, we're going to hear about it from people both inside Sony as well as outside. And that's kind of the unique, kind of perspective that we have. It also means that we easily can partner with, Sony Pictures and the colorists that work there and the color scientists to talk about what it is they're doing, what it is they need. And we can easily look at, the Sony reference monitors and say, this is the target for our consumer televisions, even though those two products are built by different business units. We can come together and say, well, how do we make a $3,000 TV perform like a $30,000 reference monitor? What did you guys do to make it work? And then we can try to replicate that on the consumer side. It's just easier for us to do those things.
Would you say that the communication between those different business units is good? Because I happen to know that in some companies, one business unit has no clue what the other business unit is doing. And that's always very frustrating to me.
Yeah, well, I will say this. Sony's a very large corporation.
Very large.
Very, very large. In most countries and not all continents. I don't know about Sony in Antarctica.
Yeah, right.
So essentially, there are areas where our communication internal, structure is more effective than others, to be quite frank. Right.
Okay, I suppose like anywhere.
If I was to come and say, oh yeah, everything's always perfect in a company with 100,000 people, of course that just physically can't be true.
No.
But in terms of what we're talking about here today with consumer display technologies, we've made a concerted effort over the last, for a very long time, but at least over the last decade, to work very closely with those core groups, even so far as to merge at higher levels of management. Our projector business and our TV business now fall under a single head. They used to be completely separate.
Oh.
They fall under now like a single head to make sure that we can take advantage of technologies and lessons learned kind of between those groups. And the same kind of thing we can see with the display engineering from our professional displays and our consumer displays. As a matter of fact, Sony professional displays, now again, I'm not talking about the master monitor right now, but our kind of video displays that you would use for digital signage. We've gotten to the point where essentially those are Sony consumer televisions with some of the brains removed that you don't need on that space. So we've done a lot of work to bring those business units very close together to share, those learnings and technologies.
One thing that I know you wanted to talk about a little bit, and I do too, is the impact of HDR on the entire production and experience
Hmm.
of video content. We talked about it earlier, how much easier it is to do on a flat panel than it is to do on a projector.
Right.
But still, now HDR, we're seeing tons of content with HDR, and it does make a big difference from my perspective on the consumer experience. You know, I sit there and I look at that and I go, whoa, that looks so much better. Much more than, oh, okay, I've quadrupled the number of pixels.
Absolutely. You know, when you really think about it, I'm not going to suggest that I've made this up, but internally at Sony for a number of years now, we've talked about the 3 C's of picture quality: clarity, color, and contrast. Unfortunately, that's the wrong order.
Mm.
In terms of importance, it's contrast, color, and clarity. If you had a choice between better contrast and better clarity, go with better contrast.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a choice between better color or better clarity, go with better color.
Mm-hmm.
Because those are more impactful to how we see things. And it also, from a foundational perspective, makes sense. Contrast and color are inexorably connected together. We talk about color gamut, that's fine, that's interesting, but color volume, the combination of contrast and color is much more impactful. And of course, if I can only show you 2 different colors at once, I don't care how much resolution you have. Your resolution is 2.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So
right.
color is, you know, the ability to show difference in hue and tint and tones of color is what enables you to see resolution anyway. Right. So contrast, color, and clarity. So contrast is a major or a significant improvement to the industry. When we went from high definition to 4K, you know, a lot of customers were like, okay, yeah, but is this going to be a 3D thing? You know, is this hot now and it's not going to be hot in a couple of years? Am I going to buy all these new 4K Blu-rays and then suddenly no, I can't play them anymore?
Right.
And of course, because it was a core display technology, we were never going to go back. But really, HDR is what kicked this whole thing kind of into high gear, because it has enabled, you know, content creators a completely new way to envision what it is they're trying to do. Things look more real, obviously. There's more depth, there's more texture, there's more, you know, kind of engagement that can happen. There's more interesting things that artists can do. You know, animation is actually something that I want to talk about very briefly because it is so flexible. I remember having a meeting with the CTO of Sony Animation, and he was explaining to me that they still have to teach what HDR is to a lot of film directors. They don't get it yet.
Really?
They're still learning how to use it. You know,
wow,
rather
even
than just
now.
rather than just make sun bright, you know, make shadow
right.
dark. It's
Right.
like what you can actually do. And so in
Right.
the world of animation, it's especially interesting. With traditional, you know, kind of shooting, your entire shot is either going to be SDR, it's going to be HDR. Right? It's just going to live. It's just a container, right? It's just, you know, is your black absolute? Is it 0 or is it relative because it's gamma, right? Which of those is it going to be? But with animation, what you can actually do within even a given still is you can have different contrast languages being used. You can combine SDR and HDR in real time
within a given image.
Within a given image, so you can really drive home, you know, what it is that you want to show. So there's obviously an element of artificiality when it comes to animation. That's kind of what makes it so interesting. And so that we can have this kind of hyper realism that exists within that space by combining the two in unique and interesting kind of ways. But HDR continues to really drive the industry forward, not just in, you know, movie content and television shows, but also gaming content. It really is, it has been and continues to be a major game changer in the industry. And so with Sony displays, whether they're CLED based or SXRD, OLED, QD-OLED, you know, what have you, we've decided to take a very aggressive kind of approach with the support that we have for, you know, HDR, whether it's HDR10, whether it's hybrid log gamma, the promise that hopefully one day will be fulfilled. And of course, Dolby Vision, we want to give that kind of experience to as many customers across as many mediums as possible.
Sure. Although interestingly, Dolby Vision, I've only heard of one projector that actually implements Dolby Vision. And that's the 4-movie ultra short throw. Why hasn't Dolby Vision become more common in projectors?
So part of the challenge it goes back to the challenge with HDR in projection, right? First, one is limited brightness. The other major challenge is that with Dolby, the primary difference, and I'm sure most of your audience, if not all of your audience, already knows this, but the difference between HDR10 and Dolby Vision is metadata. You have more information about each frame so that your display can make a decision. Because chances are the requirements of a given scene may be beyond the capabilities of your display. Right. So in order to make the best decision, it needs to know or wants to know as much as possible about that given frame. That's the difference, right? So part of the challenge with Dolby Vision is projectors don't really know a lot about themselves, right? Think about a 2,000 lumen projector. That's great. But how dark is your room? Are you actually getting black level in your room? The projector doesn't know. How big is your screen? Because 2,000 lumens on a 200-inch and 2,000 lumens on a 100-inch, there's a 4 times difference in terms of brightness there. And then what's the gain of your screen? Are you doing a negative gain? Are you doing like a 0.8? Are you doing like a 1.4? That's a 60% swing in terms of brightness. All of these things are variables that make HDR more complicated kind of than necessary. The other final challenge with Dolby Vision is simply this. There is no projector standard that we can point to. There's not an EOTF made for projectors specifically. There's not a particular model like the Sony BVM series of mastering monitors. They largely are the de facto industry standard for flat panel. That's what pretty much every studio uses. That's the reference standard.
Right.
There is no equivalent on the projector side. So it's hard to point at something and say, this is right, this is the standard, this is the target, this is the goal, kind of meet it. It's all up to artistic interpretation by each manufacturer. And that's the primary challenge, is that no one has really taken the cost and the time to develop a standard and then get every other manufacturer to agree to adopt it, at which point Dolby Vision would be a thing. So any manufacturer that wants to spend, the $10 million to do that work could, but they may not be able to sell any projectors, and make up that cost.
Yeah.
So that's the reason the industry is where it is.
So why is it though that projectors can do HDR10?
So all projectors and televisions can basically handle HDR because the processor, in the case of Sony television or projectors, I'll just say this: the Sony projector generates real-time metadata on a frame-by-frame basis anyway. So the fact that you're not getting the metadata in the frame from the source,
Dolby Vision,
it's kind of immaterial because it's being generated in real time. But again, part of the difference between the two is Dolby Vision kind of requires a standard. And there isn't one for projectors. Now, you mentioned
there is one
Dolby,
for flat panels.
There is one for flat panels. Now, you mentioned kind of the Dolby Cinema.
Yeah.
And you might say, well, that's a standard. And that's kind of true. You could have that standard if you buy those exact 2 projectors and you have that exact same size screen at that distance, at that gain.
Yep.
And that same outboard processor, then you can create it.
Sure.
But because
that's only $1 million.
That's only $1 million. But because a projector is not a standalone kind of product, here's the fun riddle. Tell me how a flashlight makes the color black, because that's what a projector is. Projectors don't make black.
Right.
Projectors don't make contrast. Your room makes black level. The projector's job is to preserve it. And so with all of these external variables to projection, it's really hard to have a standard. So we can have HDR and we can follow as closely the EOTF as we can or want to. In the case of Sony, we do frame by frame analysis. We use our knowledge about creative intent, and we look at the professional monitor to tune the processor to get as close to that feeling that we can in a projector, knowing there are hard limitations to the technology.
Right. Okay, well, we're almost out of time here, and we had so much more to talk about, so I'll just have to ask you to come back another time.
I'm always happy to do that. This is it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it has. I do have one last question, though, for you on the concept of video. We've been talking about HDR and The other thing that I find very compelling, but a lot of people object to, is higher frame rate. Movies are shot at 24 frames per second. They have been for 100 years. And now we've seen a couple of examples of higher frame rate. James Cameron, you mentioned him. You've worked with him on the Cine Alta cameras. He likes to shoot at higher frame rates. Ang Lee likes to shoot at higher frame rates. But a lot of people object to it. I personally find it very compelling. And another thing that is a radical improvement in video display quality. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think from the cinema from the cinema side, from the movie theater side, it's a heck of an ask, right? It's not that 30 or 60 or 120 is wrong. It's just we're used to it. We're used to 24.
We're used to it.
We know what to expect. It's funny. I see it, and I know what people are talking about. But it's always funny when people say the soap opera effect. All you're talking about is the fact that soap operas famously were shot on video instead of film,
right?
Because they had no off season,
right?
So they were constantly editing. Every week they had to edit a whole episode. So video was the most efficient. The frame rate was slightly different, and so that's what gives it the look of video. And it's kind of this. Well, it obviously looks different, and different is bad. And of course, we can have
HDR looks different, and that's obviously good.
Yeah. Well, it took a while to get there. No, it's a great point. But I think in terms of high frame rate, there's good news for people looking for that kind of experience. It is hard to get TV manufacturers to agree on anything, let alone broadcasters, studios, and everybody else. But several years ago, as part of the new 2020 essentially standard, which standardized, among other things, HDR, we also set out a roadmap that standardized resolution, color bit depth, as well as frame rates up to 240 hertz.
Wow.
So the standard that everyone is working under includes those parameters. We can go up to, 8K, 240, 12-bit color, 444, 2020 color space, and we all agree on what that will look like. Whether or not, or who's going to be the first studio to go there is always the question. What it really comes down to at the end of the day is that movie studios, they're businesses. They're making art, but this is mass media art. This is like art, just like the art in a hotel room is art. Someone was paid to make that painting, but they wanted to sell 1 million copies of it. And so, studios really have to ask themselves for the cost of investment for new cameras, for new mastering equipment. Broadcasters have to accept that new transmission mediums. Now that we're in this streaming world, every streaming company, their storage requirements would, quadruple instantaneously to do that kind of stuff.
Sure.
If there's not a good return on that investment, you're not going to see a huge appetite for that to happen. But I will tell you this. This is the last thing I'll say. I know I apologize. We're a little over time.
That's fine.
Same thing with 4K. Same thing with high definition. Same thing with HDR. The first step will be displays will be manufactured that can take advantage of it. And then someone will decide on the content side of the house to make content for it. No studio was going to make 4K until there was a 4K TV. No studio made high definition until there was a high definition TV. And now that you're starting to see beyond 120 hertz panels, now they're primarily right now exclusively in the gaming space. But as you continue to see the adoption of those technologies, there will come a time when you'll be watching, sports, I think, in a much higher frame rate than low resolution, 60p versus high resolution 30p. You'll actually be able to watch either 4K or 8K at much higher frame rates and get a very natural, realistic expression of especially things like live sports.
Live sports. I think you're right. I think that's where it will appear first. Well, it's an exciting new world as always, and I sure appreciate you being here.
Oh, it was absolutely my pleasure, Scott. I'm glad to do this, and call me back. Let me know. We can go through the rest of our list of things to talk about.
I will. Hey, there's Chris. How you doing, man?
Hey, what's going on? I took a nap here for a minute. You guys were on autopilot.
No. You were behind the scenes. I can see you. So yeah, some interesting stuff here, huh, Chris?
Yeah, the thing I really like is the brand new Sony laser projectors. Those are the biggest delta that I've seen from year to year. And then especially with the QD OLEDs, I know this time last year we were talking about this before we hopped on the podcast. You know, some of the press gets first look at what's going on with what this and that. So around this time last year, we were talking about the QD OLED stuff, and just to see that stuff in person was just a massive shift. So Sony's up to some really cool stuff this year for sure. I love Sony. There is no surprise. I famously said this several times. I shoot on Sony glass. I shoot on Sony cameras. I have Sony TVs. You know, it's just a matter of time before I get a Sony projector.
You know, look at that, Rob. Rob's pointing to his headphones, and Rusty Bones is.
Oh yeah, I'm using the Sony headphones now from the
Rob
press
using
event that we had
Sony
last
headphones?
Year. Yeah.
Well, you know, we don't want this to be a Sony advertorial because we're trying to just get information out there. But you know,
I'm a fan. You know, you can gush over stuff that you like.
So am I.
But that's it.
So I'm sorry. I'm sorry, everybody. I am too, and it's not just because I got Rob Brennan on the show. All right.
This is the guy from JVC, right? I was just talking about Sony.
Yeah. Right. Hey, we got a JVC guy on here. We'll talk about JVC, and it'll be fine too. I'm a fan of theirs as well. So, you know, you don't have to be only fans of one company, but if a company does a good job, then it's worth recognizing. And I do recognize that here in this particular case. So, thanks to Chris for managing everything backstage.
Thank you.
Thanks to Rob for being here and sharing his expertise. I always look forward to seeing you at one event or another. You'll be at CES, I assume.
I don't know where I'm going to be even tomorrow. I'm sure
all I know is that there will be coffee.
As long as there's coffee, then you're fine. Okay. All right.
At a minimum.
Great. Well, Rob, thanks again so much for being here. It's been really a fun conversation. And thanks to all of you for watching. And look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, geek out.